On a cold February morning in 1793, a woman once draped in diamonds and silks was dragged through the streets of Paris toward the guillotine, screaming for her life in a way that haunted witnesses for years to come. But here's what makes her story, and the stories of royal mistresses throughout history, so fascinating. Some of these women were adored by the public, celebrated as heroines and champions of the people, while others were despised, blamed for everything from national bankruptcy to moral decay, and the difference between love and hatred often had nothing to do with their actual behavior and everything to do with how they wielded power, where they came from, and how the public chose to see them. Today we're diving into the most loved and most hated royal mistresses in history, women who changed kingdoms from the bedroom, influenced wars and religion, and whose reputations were shaped by forces far beyond their control. These aren't just tales of romance and scandal. They're stories about class, power, propaganda, and the impossible standards placed on women who dared to rise above their station. Let's start with that woman screaming on her way to the guillotine. Madame du Barry's journey from poverty to Versailles to the guillotine became a symbol of everything the French Revolution sought to destroy. Born Jeanne Bécu in 1743, to an unwed mother, she worked as a shop girl and possibly as a prostitute, before becoming the mistress of a count, who essentially pimped her out to wealthy clients. She was beautiful, charming, and sexually experienced in ways that aristocratic women were not, which is precisely what attracted the aging Louis V when he met her in 1768. By 1769, she was installed at Versailles as the official royal mistress, a position that required she be married to a nobleman for propriety's sake. So they hastily married her to a count's brother, who immediately left court and never saw her again. At Versailles, du Barry was despised from the moment she arrived. The court aristocracy considered her vulgar, common, and inappropriate, a literal prostitute wearing the jewels of France. Marie Antoinette, who was Dauphine at the time, refused to speak to her for years, and courtiers mocked her accent, her manners, and her ignorance of court protocol. But Louis XV adored her simplicity and warmth after decades of court formality, and he showered her with gifts, a chateau, jewels worth millions, dresses, furnishings, and a standard of living that was obscene even by Versailles standards. Every franc spent on du Barry was a franc that couldn't be spent on the starving poor, and as France's financial crisis deepened in the 1770s, she became a convenient target for public rage. Political cartoons portrayed her as a grasping whore bankrupting the nation, and pamphlets detailed her sexual exploits in graphic terms designed to humiliate her. But things got worse. When Louis XV died of smallpox in 1774, du Barry was immediately banished from court by the new king, Louis XVI, and she retreated to her chateau. During the Revolution, she made the fatal mistake of travelling to London several times to recover jewels she had hidden there, which revolutionaries interpreted as fleeing France with the nation's wealth. She was arrested in 1793, and unlike most aristocrats who went to the guillotine with stoic courage, du Barry completely broke down, weeping, screaming, and begging the crowd for mercy in a way that witnesses found both pitiful and undignified. She was 49 years old when the blade fell, and her last words, "One more moment, Mr. Executioner," haunted the executioner for the rest of his life. Du Barry became a symbol of royal excess and corruption, but her real crime was being a visible woman from the lower classes who had risen too high and spent too much at exactly the wrong moment in history. But not every mistress from humble beginnings was destroyed by her origins, because Nell Gwyn, the orange seller turned actress who became the mistress of King Charles II of England in the 1660s, somehow became known as the Protestant whore in the most affectionate way possible. Born around 1650 in a London alley, Eleanor Gwyn grew up in poverty so extreme that her mother ran a brothel and eventually drowned drunk in a ditch. Nell started selling oranges in the Theatre Royal at 14, her quick wit and natural charm catching the attention of theatre managers who put her on stage. She couldn't really act in the classical sense, but she had something better: timing, humour, and an ability to connect with an audience that made her a star. When Charles II, newly restored to the throne after years of Puritan rule, spotted her performing around 1668, he was captivated not just by her beauty, but by her irreverence. Unlike the aristocratic women at court who treated him with calculated deference, Nell treated him like a man, not a monument. She called him Charles, made fun of his other mistresses, and brought a lightness to his life that he desperately needed. What made Nell beloved while other mistresses were despised? Simple. She never forgot where she came from, and she never pretended to be anything she wasn't. And here's the moment that defined her legend. When an angry mob once surrounded her carriage, mistaking it for that of the king's Catholic mistress, Louise de Querouaille, Nell stuck her head out the window and shouted, "Pray, good people, be civil, I am the Protestant whore." The crowd erupted in cheers. She understood public relations before the term existed. While other mistresses demanded titles and estates, Nell asked Charles for land to build a hospital for retired soldiers, and she used her influence to help ordinary people petition the king. She was generous with money she received, giving freely to friends and strangers alike. When she bore Charles 2 sons, she raised them without pretension, famously calling one of them "you little bastard," until Charles gave him a title just to make her stop. The public saw her as one of their own, who happened to sleep with the king, not as a grasping social climber trying to destroy the monarchy from within. When she died in 1687 at just 37, possibly from a stroke, she left instructions for her servants to be paid and the poor to be fed, and even King James II, Charles's brother, respected her final wishes. Nell proved that a mistress could be popular if she remained authentic, generous, and never seemed to take herself too seriously. But while Nell Gwynn charmed the public during Charles II's reign, another of his mistresses became one of the most despised women in England, because Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, was hated not because she was subtle and manipulative, but because she was loud, proud, and absolutely shameless about her power over the king. Born in 1640 to a royalist family, Barbara was beautiful, sexually confident and ambitious from the start. She became Charles's mistress in 1660, just as he was being restored to the throne, and unlike other mistresses who maintained some discretion, Barbara flaunted her position. She had apartments in Whitehall Palace directly above the king's, gave birth to 5 children by Charles, and possibly 1 or 2 by other lovers, while still being the king's official mistress, demanded titles and money constantly, and made such scenes when jealous that the entire court could hear her screaming at the king. Charles made her Duchess of Cleveland, gave her vast estates, and appointed her children to noble titles, including making one of her sons the Duke of Grafton. The public despised her because she represented everything that was wrong with the Restoration Court. She was Catholic at a time when anti-Catholic sentiment was running high. She was extravagant when many people were poor, and she was openly promiscuous in ways that shocked even a relatively libertine society. Unlike Nell Gwynn, who was charming and humble, Barbara was arrogant and demanding. She clashed constantly with Charles's other mistresses, particularly Louise de Querouaille, and with his wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, whom she openly humiliated by having her children by Charles appointed as Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. But here's where it got really outrageous. The ultimate insult came when Barbara had an affair with John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, in the 1670s while still technically the king's mistress, and when Charles caught them together, she apparently laughed at him. By the late 1670s, Charles had tired of her dramatics and cut off her allowances. Though he continued to support their children, Barbara spent her later years gambling away her fortune, having affairs with much younger men, and fighting legal battles over property. She died in 1709 at age 68, bloated from dropsy and mostly forgotten, her children having risen to positions of power that ensured the family's future, even as their mother's reputation remained in the gutter. Barbara Villiers showed that a mistress could have tremendous power and wealth, but if she wielded it too openly and offended too many people, her legacy would be one of scandal rather than achievement. Unlike Barbara Villiers, who wielded power through tantrums and scandal, Madame de Pompadour, born Jean-Antoinette Poisson in 1721, to a family of financiers, became the most powerful woman in France for nearly 20 years, through calculated brilliance and genuine talent. Her story is one of calculated ambition, meeting genuine ability. As a child, a fortune teller supposedly told her she would one day reign over the heart of a king, and she believed it so completely that her family nicknamed her Reinette, Little Queen. She received an education far beyond what most women of her class could access, studying art, music, literature, and theatre, preparing herself for a destiny she could feel approaching. She married at 20 to a man who could provide her with money and status, but she never stopped positioning herself in places where King Louis XV might notice her. When she finally caught his eye at a masked ball in 1745, she was 23, beautiful, cultured, and ready. Within months she was installed at Versailles as the official royal mistress, a position that came with apartments, a title, Marquise de Pompadour, and access to power that most politicians could only dream of. What made Pompadour different from other mistresses was that she understood her physical relationship with the king wouldn't last forever, so she made herself indispensable in other ways. She became his advisor, his confidante, his tastemaker, and his political ally. She influenced everything from military appointments to foreign policy, helping to orchestrate the alliance with Austria that led to the 7 Years' War. But here's what made her truly remarkable. She was the greatest patron of arts and culture in 18th century France, supporting Voltaire, commissioning the Encyclopédie, founding the Sèvres porcelain manufactory, and helping to create the Rococo style that defined the era. Her enemies at court, and there were many, mocked her bourgeois origins and spread vicious rumors about her sexual appetites and supposed frigidity, claiming she maintained her position through manipulation after their physical relationship cooled. But the king kept her at his side until her death in 1764 at age 42, likely from tuberculosis and heart failure, because she gave him something more valuable than sex. She gave him understanding, intellectual companionship, and a vision of France as the cultural capital of Europe. The public's opinion of her was mixed during her lifetime. The aristocracy resented her influence, and political cartoons blamed her for France's military failures. But history has been kinder, recognizing her as a woman of exceptional intelligence and ability, who exercised power in the only way available to her. But while Pompadour's intelligence eventually earned her historical respect, Alice Perrers represents one of the earliest examples of a royal mistress being blamed for national disasters. She had little power to cause. Born around 1348, possibly to a family of minor gentry, Alice entered the household of Queen Philippa of Hainault as a lady-in-waiting, and somehow caught the eye of King Edward III of England. When Queen Philippa died in 1369, Edward was 56 years old, in declining health, and increasingly dependent on Alice for companionship. She was probably in her 20s, and she quickly became the most powerful person at court, influencing judicial decisions, receiving grants of land and money, and allegedly sitting beside the king in court hearings, dressed as the personification of Lady Peace, while he presided as judge. This was considered absolutely outrageous. A woman, a commoner, a mistress, influencing the king's justice. When Edward's health declined further after suffering strokes in the mid-1370s, Alice was accused of controlling the senile king, isolating him from his sons, and looting the royal treasury for her own benefit. The truth is more complicated. Edward's sons, particularly John of Gaunt, were engaged in their own power struggles and likely exaggerated Alice's influence to diminish each other's positions. But things reached a breaking point when Edward died in 1377. Parliament immediately moved against Alice, accusing her of stealing rings from the dead king's fingers as he lay dying, a charge that may or may not have been true but was certainly symbolic of how they viewed her. She was stripped of all her lands and possessions and banished from court. Though she later managed to recover some of her property through legal maneuvering, Alice disappears from historical records after the 1380s, but the damage to her reputation was permanent. Medieval chroniclers portrayed her as a grasping, evil influence who corrupted a once great king and nearly destroyed England through her greed, when in reality she was probably a clever woman who took advantage of opportunities in a system that offered women almost no legitimate paths to power. The misogyny in how Alice Perrers was remembered is staggering. She was blamed for military defeats in France, economic problems, and the king's declining health, as if one woman could cause all of England's problems simply by sleeping with an elderly monarch. While Alice Perrers was destroyed by accusations of manipulating an aging king, Diane de Poitiers presents one of history's most fascinating power dynamics. A woman 20 years older than her royal throne, lover who dominated the French court for decades through sheer force of personality and political acumen. Born in 1499 to an aristocratic family, Diane was married at 15 to a man 40 years her senior, and when he died, she became a widow at 32 with significant wealth and no intention of remarrying. King Henri II of France had been infatuated with her since he was a teenager. She had been a presence at court his entire life, elegant and unattainable, and when he became king in 1547 at age 28, he made the 48-year-old Diane his official mistress, much to the horror of his wife Catherine de' Medici and the confusion of the court. How did she maintain this position? Through absolute confidence and control. While Catherine de' Medici was the queen, Diane de Poitiers was the power behind the throne, and everyone knew it. Henri gave her the crown jewels, not to borrow, but to keep. He gave her castles, including Chenceau, the most beautiful chateau in France. He intertwined their initials in royal architecture and had her monogram placed on official documents. She controlled access to the king, influenced political appointments, and accumulated wealth that would be worth hundreds of millions today. Her secret was understanding that Henri needed a strong maternal figure as much as a lover. His childhood had been traumatic, spent as a hostage in Spain, and Diane provided stability, advice, and unwavering support. She was also, by all accounts, strikingly beautiful, well into her 50s, maintaining her looks through a regime of cold baths, horseback riding, and a diet that was healthy by any era's standards. The public's view of Diane was complex. The aristocracy respected her power even as they resented it, while ordinary people were fascinated by this older woman's hold over their young king. But her downfall came swiftly. When Henri died in 1559 from a jousting accident, his eye pierced by a lance in a tournament Diane had begged him not to enter. Everything changed. Catherine de' Medici, finally free, immediately demanded Diane return the crown jewels and give up Censo. Diane spent her final years in a lesser chateau, dying in 1566 at age 66, her power evaporating the moment her protector did. Recent analysis of her remains shows toxic levels of gold in her system, suggesting her beauty regime, which included drinking liquid gold, a supposed elixir of youth, may have slowly poisoned her. Diane's story shows that even the most powerful mistress was always one heartbeat away from losing everything. But while Diane de Poitiers died of old age after decades of power, Agnès Sorel holds the distinction of being France's first officially recognized royal mistress, a position that brought her both influence and enemies that may have led to her death at just 28 years old. Born around 1422 to a family of minor nobility, Agnès became a lady-in-waiting to the Queen and caught the attention of King Charles VII in the early 1440s. She was described as extraordinarily beautiful, with a famous portrait showing her with one bare breast, a shocking display of sexuality for the time. Charles was completely captivated by her, and unlike previous kings who had hidden their affairs, he openly acknowledged Agnès as his mistress, giving her the title Dame de Beauté and installing her at court with honours usually reserved for queens. This openness scandalized France. The church condemned her as a temptress, leading the king into sin. Courtiers resented her influence over royal policy, and the Dauphin, the future Louis XI, absolutely loathed her, seeing her as a threat to his own power. But Agnès used her position to support French military efforts against the English in the final years of the 100 Years' War, allegedly shaming Charles into taking more aggressive action by suggesting he was being weak. She bore Charles 4 daughters, all of whom he acknowledged and provided for, and she accumulated significant wealth through the king's gifts. Then in 1450, while pregnant with their 5th child, Agnès suddenly became violently ill with severe abdominal pain and died within days. She was only 28 years old. The official cause was dysentery or complications from childbirth, but rumours immediately began that she had been poisoned. The prime suspect was the Dauphin, who had every reason to want her dead, and who showed no grief at her passing. And here's where it gets really interesting. In 2005, French scientists exhumed her remains and found extremely high levels of mercury in her hair and bones, confirming that she had been poisoned, though whether accidentally through beauty products or deliberately through murder remains unclear. Agnès Sorel was hated by many during her life for breaking the taboo around royal mistresses and wielding influence above her station, but her mysterious death turned her into a tragic figure, and her patronage of the arts and support for French military efforts have earned her a more sympathetic place in history than many of her contemporaries enjoyed. Unlike Agnès Sorel, who died young and under mysterious circumstances, Madame de Maintenon achieved something almost no other royal mistress ever did. She went from servant to secret wife of the most powerful king in Europe and lived to age 83. Born Françoise d'Aubigné in 1635, in a prison where her father was being held for counterfeiting, she experienced poverty, converted to Catholicism from Protestantism under duress, and married the poet Paul Scarron, who was paralyzed and deformed, when she was just 16. After his death, she was hired as governess to the illegitimate children King Louis XIV had fathered with another mistress, Madame de Montespan. This was supposed to be a quiet, invisible position, but Françoise was intelligent, pious, and possessed a calm dignity that attracted the king's attention. As he tired of Montespan's temper and jealousy, he found himself drawn to conversations with the governess, who never asked him for anything, never made scenes, and provided intellectual and spiritual companionship. By the late 1670s, she had become his confidante and then his lover, though she insisted on discretion and morality in a way that completely changed the atmosphere at Versailles. When Queen Marie-Thérèse died in 1683, Louis secretly married Françoise in a private ceremony, making her his wife in the eyes of God if not the state. She was never queen. Announcing a marriage to a commoner would have been politically impossible, but she was the king's partner for the last 32 years of his life, influencing his turn toward religious conservatism and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which expelled Protestant Huguenots from France. The court knew about the secret marriage but could never openly acknowledge it, creating a strange dynamic where Maintenon wielded enormous influence but always had to maintain the pretense of being merely a friend and advisor. The public viewed her with suspicion. She was blamed for making the elderly Louis XIV less fun, more pious, more concerned with morality than glory, but she was also respected for her dignity and her genuine charitable work, including founding a school for impoverished noble girls at St. Cyr. When Louis died in 1715, Maintenon retired to St. Cyr and lived there until her own death in 1719 at age 83. Having risen from poverty to become the secret wife of the Sun King through patience, intelligence, and an understanding that sometimes power is more secure when it's not announced with trumpets. But while Maintenon achieved security through discretion and patience, Anne Boleyn occupies a unique position on this list, because she started as a mistress before becoming queen, and it was precisely her ambition to make that transition that made her so hated and ultimately got her killed. Born around 1501 to an ambitious gentry family, Anne spent years at the French court before returning to England in the 1520s, sophisticated, cultured, and well-versed in the art of courtly flirtation. When King Henry VIII began pursuing her around 1526, Anne did something revolutionary. She refused to become his mistress. Henry's previous relationships with women had followed a pattern. He pursued them, seduced them, tired of them, discarded them. But Anne understood that if she gave in, she would end up like her own sister Mary, who had been Henry's mistress and was cast aside with nothing. So Anne held out for marriage, and Henry, increasingly obsessed, decided to break from the Catholic Church, divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne instead. This decision tore England apart. Catherine was beloved by the people, supported by Spain and the Pope, and considered a virtuous, wronged wife. Anne was seen as the homewrecker, who destroyed a marriage, broke England from Rome, and caused religious upheaval purely out of ambition. The propaganda against her was vicious. She was called a whore, a witch, a seductress with 6 fingers on one hand, who had bewitched the king through dark magic. In reality, Anne was intelligent, religiously reformist, and politically active in ways that threatened powerful men at court, including Thomas Cromwell. But when she failed to produce a male heir, she gave birth to the future Elizabeth I, but then suffered at least 2 miscarriages. Henry turned against her with stunning speed. In 1536, she was arrested on absurd charges of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, charges that were almost certainly fabricated. She was found guilty in a show trial and executed by sword on May 19, 1536, dying at around 35 years old, her daughter Elizabeth just 2.5. The hatred directed at Anne Boleyn during her lifetime was extraordinary. Crowds jeered when she was crowned queen, pamphlets called for her death, and when she was arrested, almost no one spoke in her defense. But modern historians have rehabilitated her reputation, recognizing that she was a highly educated, capable woman who was destroyed by a king who couldn't accept that his own inability to father surviving sons might be his problem rather than hers. Anne Boleyn shows how a woman labeled as a mistress or homewrecker can be hated in her own time, but reconsidered by history once the propaganda is stripped away and her story is told more fairly. And speaking of being reconsidered by history, our final most loved mistress is controversial, because for decades she was the most hated woman in Britain. But Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, represents the ultimate reversal of public opinion. Born in 1947 to an upper-class family, Camilla Shand met Prince Charles in the early 1970s, and by most accounts they fell genuinely in love. But Charles was pressured to marry a virginal aristocratic bride, appropriate for a future king, so he chose Diana Spencer while maintaining his emotional connection to Camilla, who had married Andrew Parker Bowles. The revelation in the 1990s that Charles had been having an affair with Camilla throughout his marriage to Diana made her the most vilified woman in the world. The tabloids called her a homewrecker, published unflattering photos, and blamed her for Diana's misery and eventual death. She received death threats, was booed in public, and became the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. But something remarkable happened over the following 2 decades. The public narrative shifted. As the initial grief and anger over Diana's death faded, people began to acknowledge that Charles and Camilla had a genuine, long-standing love affair, that the forced marriage to Diana had been a mistake by the royal family, and that Camilla had never sought publicity or tried to compete with Diana's popularity. She appeared dignified, self-deprecating, and genuinely devoted to Charles, supporting his charitable work without seeking the spotlight. She waited years before marrying Charles in 2005, accepted the lesser title of Duchess of Cornwall instead of Princess of Wales out of respect for Diana's memory, and slowly won over the British public through decades of quiet, consistent service. When Queen Elizabeth II died in 22 and Charles became king, Camilla became Queen Consort, later shortened to Queen, with the blessing of the late Queen and the acceptance of most of the public. Younger generations who never knew Diana view Camilla simply as Charles's wife, while older Britons have largely made peace with the relationship, recognizing that the fairy tale they wanted for Charles and Diana was never real. Camilla's story shows that public opinion can be turned around, but it takes time, consistency, and a willingness to let your actions speak louder than your self-defense. These 10 women, 5 loved, 5 hated, reveal something fundamental about how we judge female power. The loved mistresses succeeded by either staying humble and charming like Nell Gwyn, making themselves culturally indispensable like Pompadour, wielding power with such confidence that respect became inevitable, like Diane de Poitiers, exercising influence quietly and piously like Maintenon, or simply outlasting public hatred through consistency, like Camilla. The hated mistresses were destroyed by timing like Dobari, by misogynistic propaganda like Alice Perez, by shamelessness like Barbara Villiers, by mysterious circumstances like Agnès Sorel, or by threatening the existing power structure too directly, like Anne Boleyn. What's striking is how little their actual behavior mattered compared to public perception, class origins, and historical timing. A mistress could be generous and still be hated if she spent too much during a financial crisis, or she could accumulate vast wealth and be loved if she made people laugh and stayed loyal to her class origins. These women were working within systems that gave them almost no legitimate power, so they took what power they could through the only route available. Their relationships with kings, and history has judged them far more harshly than it has judged the kings who put them in those positions in the first place. Whether loved or hated, every one of these women shaped history, influenced policy, patronized arts, and left legacies that extended far beyond the bedroom, even as that bedroom is all that most people remember about them. Their stories remind us that the line between beloved icon and hated villain often has less to do with virtue and more to do with visibility, timing, and whether you threaten the people writing your story. If you found these stories as fascinating as I did, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into royal history, and let me know in the comments which of these mistresses you think was treated most unfairly by history. I have a feeling the answer might surprise you.